The 100th anniversary of JFK's birth provides a good opportunity to try. Time cannot fully erase the inspiration created by his public words and deeds. They altered history, and they continue to be a source of fascination for new generations who didn't live during Kennedy's presidency. In many ways, JFK's success in life was partly of birthright, predestined by the power and privilege of the Kennedy family. But his birthright was just the cornerstone of his legacy. In the spring of 1936, a young JFK's health deteriorated. He had been studying at the London School of Economics, but had to come home.
They thought it might be jaundice, they thought it might be some other sort of disease, and it turned out it was Addison, the house that Jack built, because Jack Kennedy was the one that built the house.
Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country.
Piece by piece, Jack Kennedy constructed his own unique legacy. And this is the house that Jack built.
Funding for this program is provided by Sabra R. Pertil and the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation, Joseph Erdman Trustee. Additional support provided by the following:
For just about all of us, even those of us who are older, it's hard to imagine JFK at 100. He's frozen in time at age 46, and he looked younger than that. There's been so much attention to all things Kennedy for more than a half century that it's hard to believe that there might be unseen photos or untold stories, and yet there are, and that's why you've come here, and we're going to show them to you. Lana Sherrard, you have managed to collect photos that have never been seen before of President Kennedy or the Kennedy family.
I just started collecting because I wanted to have a little piece of history. And then as I started to collect, I realized just how much there was that was in private hands. I have a lot of photos, a lot of photos. A lot of these photos are unpublished. I feel that we need to have these open to the public, not put away somewhere. President Kennedy has this amazing ability, even in death, to bring people together. People often wonder what could have been. And we all have that question, I think. It also is a question that I think brings people to learn about him more. It defines him, unfortunately. But when you do learn more, there is so much more to learn.
At the time that the Kennedys lived here, Brookline was a changing community. This was a starter home for Mr. and Mrs. Kennedy. While the Kennedys lived here, this street had not even been fully developed. This house was the last house on the street. Well, John F. Kennedy was born in this house in the master bedroom on the second floor on May 29th, 1917 at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. It was a somewhat cloudy day. Mrs. Kennedy wanted to make sure that the doctor had all the available light that he would need to attend to the birth. So Mrs. Kennedy used the bed closest to the window. Mr. Kennedy was not in attendance. He would have been downtown in Boston at his office, as was customary at the time. The Kennedys quickly outgrew this home. Within the course of 5 years, they had 4 children: Joe Jr., Jack, Rosemary, and Kathleen. And the year that they moved out, Mrs. Kennedy was already expecting her 5th child.
It was one of the largest families, and of course, celebratory families in America. The press covered them extensively. And being from so wealthy a family, John Kennedy was able to go to private schools. And so he went to Choate in New England, the prominent private school where the sons of elite went.
John F. Kennedy was here for 4 years, following in the footsteps of his older brother. JFK entered in 1931 and graduated in 1935. He really didn't have a great time here when he was a student. All the teachers recognized that he had the capability. He didn't apply himself. Joe Kennedy Jr. was sent here, so it was natural that Jack would follow. Joe was the natural athlete. So then along comes Jack, who couldn't physically measure up to his brother. Jack just didn't like rules, or didn't like them to apply to him. So he decided to be sort of a nonconformist, a cut-up. Jack Kennedy had a group of pals, informally called the Muckers, about a dozen of them. And they took the name from a derogatory term for Irish workers. They're pranksters. Lem Billings was a classmate. Jack and Lem roomed together for 2 years, their junior and senior year here at Choate.
They met when they were working on the school yearbook. I think what drew them together was a mutual dislike of the school and the fact that they both had higher achieving older brothers at the school. So there was a little bit of sibling rivalry there, and they both had a very similar sense of humor. So it was a friendship that took off from the beginning. I think another ingredient in their bonding was the fact that JFK was sick a great deal when he was at Choate. Lem helped take care of him. It's not entirely clear, but I think he found out that Lem was gay pretty early on. There appears to have been a letter written by Lem in 1934 that seemed to suggest that he was interested in Jack in more than a platonic way. And JFK responded in a letter saying, "I'm not that kind of boy." But it didn't end the friendship. One of the events that bonded them was a trip to Europe that they both took together in 1937. They took together, just the two of them, 2 Americans in Europe at a critical point just 2 years before the war broke out. And they traveled around Nazi Germany, Mussolini's Italy. They were even on the French-Spanish border during the Spanish Civil War. The trip influenced them both a great deal, especially JFK politically. And of course, it further cemented their friendship. Of course, the Kennedy family was a Catholic family, in some ways quite conservative. But by all accounts, they accepted Lem almost as fully as JFK did. Lem visited the Kennedy homes in Palm Beach and Hyannisport and stayed there for weeks at a time, so often, in fact, that Joe Kennedy JFK's father said at one point that Lem was his second son. They remained very close. They exchanged letters during the war, even though they were in different theaters of the war. After they came home, Lem was involved in JFK's political campaigns, to the consternation of JFK's political operatives, because Lem was not that interested in politics and he wasn't very good at it. But JFK wanted him involved, and so he was, even though he messed up district after district in the elections that JFK fought. When JFK was president, Lem would go to the White House. He didn't even have a Secret Service pass, as incredible as that may seem today. He just walked right on in there whenever he wanted to. And when JFK was free of his political commitments, they would hang out. Lem had his own room at the White House and would frequently be at the White House, so much so that actually Jackie Kennedy said at one point that that guy, Lem, has been a part of my marriage every single weekend since I married Jack in 1953. Many Americans still don't know that the 35th President of the United States, his best friend was a gay man for 30 years. They stayed friends until Dallas.
The Arizona heat was blistering in the summer of 1936 as Jack and his older brother Joe traced their initials in the foundation of the house. Later on, before the brothers left for Harvard, Jack and Joe pressed their fingerprints into the wet adobe near the fireplace. Having cemented their legacy at the J6 Ranch, they set out on the more challenging task of making their mark on the world. Neither could have imagined what lay ahead. Older brother Joe had been the Kennedy son designated to enter the public arena, groomed by Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. Left to his own preferences, Jack Kennedy might well have chosen journalism or publishing. World War II transformed the equation. Lieutenant Joe Kennedy was killed on a dangerous bombing run in Europe, for which he had volunteered in August 1944. Joe Sr. turned to his next oldest son, Jack. With the political backing of Rose's relatives and the financial support of his father, Jack Kennedy was a virtual shoo-in for the U.S. House of Representatives.
In 1946, he ran for a House seat in Boston. In some ways, he was what was known as a carpetbagger because he hadn't lived there in a long time. But as Joe Kennedy joked, he said, with the amount of money I put into that contest, I could have elected my chauffeur.
Kennedy was 29 when he was elected to the House. He looked like he was about 15. He was an impatient, ambitious, driven person, not particularly interested in the mechanics of the legislative process.
He wins again in 48, but he doesn't like being a member of the House. In fact, he says, we were a bunch of worms there.
And he even said after a couple of years, he says, I'm ready to leave the House. It's sort of up or out. You know, he was not interested in making a career of it.
And so he runs for the U.S. Senate. Kennedy, because he had so much charm and was so articulate, and of course, once again, Joe Kennedy put an awful lot of money into the campaign, he won the Senate seat.
Particularly in terms of his Senate career, he was a person of significant talent, great intelligence, a great historical sense. But he didn't fit in smoothly with the Senate of his time. He treated people well. Even when he disagreed with class and with dignity. But also people found him a cool, distant personality. He was not one of the boys. He didn't socialize really with senators for the most part. And Lyndon Johnson was very quick to say, you know, Kennedy has a lot of smarts with his Harvard education, but when you need someone in the trenches to actually get stuff done, he's not going to be around. He's flying around the country, focusing on other things. I don't think he had the sort of basic patience that you need to be a great legislator. And then I think by 1956, his political career completely turned around. His book, Profiles in Courage, was widely praised and became a bestseller.
We are selecting here today the man who, for the next 4 years, will be guiding for good or evil, for better or worse, the destinies of our nation and, to a large extent, the destinies of the free world.
Kennedy almost became the vice presidential candidate for Adlai Stevenson in '56. He was the darling of the Democratic Convention. Kennedy got involved in issues more seriously during the Senate. You know, he became a much more forceful speaker, a more confident speaker. During his Senate years, there's a definite maturation that occurred.
And from there, he was keenly interested in moving on to run for president because, again, he wasn't terribly interested in being a legislator. And there are no bills that you can cite that came out of the Congress during his years in the House and the Senate which carried his name and identified him as, you know, a successful legislator.
I'm just saying that it's the center of power, not power. I mean, I'm not talking about personal. I'm just saying the center of action, it's the more precise term, is the presidency. Now, if you're interested, which many, many people are, not just me, the presidency is the place for it to be, in the sense of people getting done.
The thing that we don't always appreciate is the Senate has not been the best road to the White House. Before Kennedy succeeded in 1960, the only other sitting senator to go directly to the White House was Warren Harding in 1920. And since Kennedy, the only senator to have gone directly to the White House is Barack Obama.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
The public image JFK and his administration wanted to project during his presidency was that of a magnificent rhetorician and steady leader who skillfully brought the nation through domestic and foreign crises. And while they came up short in some cases, generally they were successful.
He was the youngest man ever to be elected to the office, and he was also the first Catholic to gain the White House. And so he represented a kind of modern breakthrough in American presidential history. In fact, he used to hold live televised press conferences, and he was the first president in American history to do that.
Unquestionably, the messy reality behind the scenes contradicted the well-orchestrated public picture.
He came to the presidency wanting to be known as the foreign policy president. He wanted international affairs to be the centerpiece of his administration. And he initially did some very innovative, creative moves.
I have today signed an executive order providing for the establishment of a Peace Corps on a temporary pilot basis. This corps will be a pool of trained men and women sent overseas by the United States government or through private institutions and organizations to help foreign countries meet their urgent needs for skilled manpower.
And then in terms of foreign policy, you had the disasters of the Cuban Bay of Pigs invasion.
The Cuba of 1961, the advice of those who were brought in on the executive branch was also unanimous, and the advice was wrong. So that, and finally, and I was responsible, so it finally comes down that no matter how many advisors you have, frequently they are divided, and the president must finally choose.
You had the Berlin Wall, which we have to remember was put up in June of 1961 by the Russians.
He was keenly interested in history. He was particularly taken by books about World War I and the idea that the great leaders of those European nations, they had blundered into that horrible war, which turned out to be the most devastating conflict in human history to that point in time. He was very concerned to avert the kind of mistakes that had taken us into this disaster.
All free men, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner.
When he became president, and he asked the Pentagon for the nuclear war plan, the Joint Chiefs had a meeting with him as to what would happen if they fought a nuclear war, and they explained to Kennedy that they could kill some 270 million Russians and Eastern Europeans. And as Kennedy walked out of the room, he said to his Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, "And we call ourselves the human race." And so he was deeply disturbed by that information, and he was greatly concerned to arrive at some kind of détente with the Soviets. The breakthrough came with the Cuban Missile Crisis when they averted a nuclear holocaust.
This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere.
He was incredibly sensitive to the issue of nuclear weapons, and that how impermissible it would be for a president to have to fight a nuclear war.
We will not prematurely or unnecessarily risk the course of worldwide nuclear war, in which even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. But neither will we shrink from that risk at any time it must be faced. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, where they're found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back.
We've known since then from the materials that have been released, especially from the Soviet Union, that we came this close to a nuclear war. There could have been such a conflict. But he wisely used diplomacy.
I call upon Chairman Khrushchev to halt and eliminate this clandestine, reckless, and provocative threat to world peace and to stable relations between our two nations.
If there was one thing above all which I think he achieved, it was to avoid conflict with the Soviet Union in that Cuban Missile Crisis. And then, of course, he got the Test Ban Treaty.
A war today or tomorrow, if it led to nuclear war, would not be like any war in history. A full-scale nuclear exchange lasting less than 60 minutes with the weapons now in existence could wipe out more than 300 million Americans, Europeans, and Russians, as well as untold millions elsewhere. Yesterday, a shaft of light cut into the darkness. Negotiations were concluded in Moscow on a treaty to ban all nuclear tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. Let us make the most of this opportunity and every opportunity to reduce tension, to slow down the perilous nuclear arms race, and to check the world's slide towards final annihilation.
And there was a lot of resistance to it at the time, but his leadership was quite effective in that regard. So I think his greatest achievement in many ways was to not just avert a nuclear war, but to move the country toward some kind of agreement with the Soviets to avoid any future conflict.
The early 1960s were a transitioning time in the country for feminism and the civil rights movement. Kennedy's administration reflected that. Women played a vital supportive role in the Kennedy White House, yet they did so without titles, equal pay, and many of the perks and privileges men enjoyed.
My name is Nancy Hogan.
My name is Nancy Hogan.
My name is Nancy Hogan.
I, Nancy Hogan, work in Washington and have the rather confusing title of Administrative Assistant to a Special Assistant to the President of the United States. So let's start the cross-examination.
Number one, who sits to the right of the President in the meetings?
Dean Rusk.
Number two, who sits to the left of the President?
McNamara.
I graduated from college. I was for JFK.
Number one, I'm just curious, how come this is the first steady job you've ever held?
Well, I just graduated from college, and previously I just worked for the campaign.
So start at the top and work your way down.
And there I was, 6 months later, after graduating from college, first floor, West Wing.
And once again, it's time to vote.
We were what you called back then administrative assistants, which meant you helped follow up on policy, you helped make sure something happens.
Will the real Nancy Hogan please stand up?
So you had an opportunity to actually feel as if you were getting up every morning, being part of the new frontier, and you were changing the world.
I was in the White House press office. I had worked with Pierre Salinger during the campaign, and the morning after the election, or when it became clear that Kennedy had won, Pierre said, "You'll come to the White House, won't you, with me?" And I said, "Sure, absolutely." The press office was right around the corner from the president's office, so I was readily available for taking dictation. He had an amazingly quick mind, an inquiring mind. He was fascinated with anything, and he expected you to be able to do almost anything, and the result was that if he asked you, you could do anything. It was just a challenge to be around him all the time. We worked 7 days a week, much of the time, long into the night, traveling all over the world, and we didn't make much money either. Neither did anybody in the White House. You know, I suppose if I stopped to think about it, I might have been annoyed at the fact that none of the women had titles to speak of, and we were called girls or what have you. And had we been there longer, I can see a situation where a lot of us might have been more vocal.
And it was the times. We were not as upset as women would have been 15 years later. We were more the 50s and willing to accept that this was our slot. There were no special assistants that were women. There were no cabinet members that were women.
It's not that we were treated differently than any other women at that day and age. We weren't, I'm sure. But it was such an exciting place to be and such an exciting job that I really didn't spend an awful lot. In fact, I spent no time thinking about it. It wasn't in my psyche at all at that stage.
African Americans weren't sure what to make of their new president. Even though an estimated 68% had voted for Kennedy, they wondered how committed he really was to the cause of civil rights.
It was clearly the major domestic problem facing the United States. And yet JFK didn't do anything for the first year or the second year, and only reluctantly into his third year.
He understands that to be elected, he has to be a compromise figure. He has to appeal to segregationists. He goes very slowly. For instance, Kennedy had promised to end discrimination in housing with the stroke of a pen, and yet it takes him 2 years to actually sign an executive order to that effect. Kennedy is working in a global context, so he's dealing with the Cold War, Cuban Missile Crisis, Bay of Pigs, so one really has to consider his record within a large context. He, on the other hand, does something at a magnitude that no other president had done, which was to appoint blacks to federal posts.
It's not that he wasn't interested. It's not that he wasn't committed. He was slowly dragged into civil rights because of the integration of Ole Miss, the integration of the University of Alabama, and finally because of Martin Luther King and the movement and the sit-ins. So in June of 1963, he gave the most eloquent civil rights speech that I think any of us had ever heard.
The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for the public officials who represent him, if, in short, he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed?
Dr. King, who had once called Kennedy schizophrenic on civil rights, is overjoyed. And it is really Kennedy's finest hour. This is something that he did not have to do.
Kennedy drafted the Civil Rights Bill and submitted it to Congress. It passed the House, but by the time of his assassination, it had not passed the Senate, which was going to be very difficult. And it took an LBJ. It probably never would have passed without Lyndon Johnson. Making progress on civil rights is what we had all hoped to see much more of, and he did it, but he had to die for it.
For over 50 years, there has been an ongoing struggle to reconcile the facts of the assassination, beginning with the Warren Commission in the 1960s, then the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, and the Assassinations Records Review Act of the 1990s with its 25-year deadline ending in 2017. Much of the public has not accepted the findings of the Warren Commission that Lee Harvey Oswald alone assassinated President Kennedy. And so for many, the search for the full truth goes on. In the weeks following the publication of the Kennedy Half Century in 2013, I received hundreds of emails, letters, and tweets. I learned anew that those who have followed the assassination story these many years have long since chosen sides and are heavily invested in particular theories about it. No one will ever be able to change their minds. The controversy about the assassination shows no signs of fading away, even after almost 5.5 decades. A handful of the messages I received came from individuals who insisted they had new information about President Kennedy's assassination. I met, spoke by phone, or exchanged correspondence with the most credible of them. The mother of one of my former students at the University of Virginia, who requested that her name not be used publicly, had just begun her job at the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia in November 1963. Lone gunman advocates insist their conclusion is the logical result of the facts that have been uncovered. For example, Oswald's success in bringing a rifle to work on the morning of the Dallas motorcade was surprisingly easy. The neighbor with whom he hitched a ride early on the morning of November 22nd, Wesley Buell Frazier, said Oswald was carrying a brown paper-wrapped package that contained curtain rods, Oswald's cover for his disassembled rifle. Yet Frazier, who had the opportunity to handle and measure an Italian Carcano rifle in later years, insists that Oswald's package was too small to be the weapon. After leaving work on November 22nd, Buell Frazier headed to the hospital to check on his stepfather, who had recently suffered a heart attack. As he left his stepfather's room, Frazier was thrown against the wall by 2 Dallas police officers, then handcuffed and taken in for questioning.
They took me downtown Dallas. I sat at a chair. I couldn't look left or right. I had to look into this wall. Detective Rose and Detective Stovall, they questioned me for a long, long time. They got tired of talking, I guess, and so they sent a new set of police officers in, and the same questions over and over and over again. And they got tired, and they went out, and another crew come in. And I went through all their questions, and then Captain Will Fritz came in. He had a paper, and on that was a typed confession saying that I not only knew about the assassination, but I was part of it. And he put it down on a desk and gave me a pen and said, "Sign that." And I said, "I'm not signing it." I said, "That's ridiculous." He drew his hand back to hit me. I said, "There's police officers out there." And I said, before they get in there, I said, "You and I are going to have one hell of a fight, and I'm going to get a couple of good licks in on you." He got so red-faced, he snatched up the paper and stormed out of the room. And I was there many, many hours. I didn't go home until early hours of Saturday morning.
The purpose of today's hearing is to hear the testimony of Buell Wesley Frazier and Lenny Mae Randall. The Commission proposes to ask these witnesses questions concerning their knowledge of the assassination of President Kennedy.
My sister and I, we were notified that we were to appear before the Warren Commission.
Do you call yourself Buell or Wesley?
I go by Wesley.
Well, Wesley, what is your age?
Sir?
What is your age?
19.
I was very nervous and I was very scared because I didn't know a lot about the world.
Where do you work?
Work at Texas School Books.
Did you commute back and forth from your sister's home in Irving?
Yes, sir.
Driving back and forth with Oswald, did he ever talk about guns?
No, sir. No, he never did.
Here you had these people were supposed to be really interested in what you had to say. Some of them were so interested that they slept through most of my testimony.
Was that the 21st of November?
Yes, sir.
Well, tell us about that.
He says, "I'm going back home to get some curtain rods." He said, you know, put in an apartment.
The next morning you had breakfast. About what time?
Between 7 and 7:15.
Did you both get into the car about the same time?
Yes, sir. And when I got in the car, I noticed that there was a paper sack laying on the back seat. So I said, what's in the package, Lee? And he said, curtain rods.
Now, you knew that the president was going to pass that building sometime that morning, didn't you?
Well, I heard he would.
Did you ever talk to Oswald about that?
No, sir, I didn't.
We have over here this exhibit, which is number 364, which is a paper sack made out of tape, sort of a homemade affair. Would you take a look at this? Does this appear to be anything like the color of the sack you saw in the back seat?
Yes, sir, I'd say it was.
Would you take a look at it as to the length? Does it appear to be about the same length?
No, sir.
The dark bag is exhibited.
Even though people didn't like what they heard, I was telling them the truth. And then they put us in 2 separate rooms, and we had to make bags similar to what we had seen on November the 22nd. And all we had was brown wrapping paper, a pair of scissors, and tape. We didn't have anything to measure. They take the bag out of the room, and then come back, we gotta make another one. I can't tell you how many bags we both made. I think they were looking for something to unravel or distort our testimony. I don't think they really is looking for the truth. I've had a lot of time to think about that tragedy. Sure, we lost a president, but look at the other countless lives that tragedy affected.
On November 22, 1963, there were nearly 24 police motorcycles traveling ahead of, behind, and along the sides of the Kennedy motorcade as it slowly moved through the streets of Dallas. All of these officers had a police radio to communicate with Central Headquarters.
Michael, officer, up on Stemmons with his mic stuck open on channel 1. Could you send someone up there to tell him to shut it off?
One radio malfunctioned, broadcasting continuously during the minutes surrounding the assassination. Did this open microphone record the sounds of gunfire in Dealey Plaza? The House Select Committee on Assassinations thought so, and more than 10 years after the Warren Commission finished its work, this second government investigation used the recordings to conclude that there had been multiple shooters in Dealey Plaza, and therefore a conspiracy.
When we first heard the recording, you could hear the dominant sound of the motorcycle engine. Surely this must correlate with the movements of a motorcycle in the motorcade if it is a motorcycle in the motorcade. On a parade route with crowds coming over the edge of the sidewalk, you don't expect these things to be running at 3,000 RPM for 3 minutes at a time. But that's exactly what we saw. Thereafter, we see it drop to idle for sustained periods of time, occasional excursions in speed, but basically the motorcycle isn't going anywhere. This is completely at odds with the known movements of the motorcade. After the assassination, many elements of the motorcade raced off to Parkland Hospital. Further on in the recording, we hear the sounds of sirens and a car horn. It occurs at a time when the motorcycle engine speed is descended to near idle. So we know the bike isn't moving quickly, but we hear these sirens and we hear the car horn. The car horn is Doppler shifted. That suggests a speed difference between the motorcycle with the stuck microphone and the car. Furthermore, you can hear a police whistle being blown, and it's not Doppler shifted. That means that it is at or around the same speed as the motorcycle. From that, I would conclude that you have a stationary motorcycle being overtaken by an automobile horn, sirens. It sounds like the motorcade.
Laser President's head was likely blown off. We need some more manpower down here at this Texas Book Depository. Can you...
The recording is very interesting, but our study shows that it is not germane to the question as to the number of shooters in Dealey Plaza that day, because the motorcycle most likely wasn't in a position to record the sounds of gunfire.
In 1992, in response to Oliver Stone's movie JFK and the controversy that it generated, Congress did a very sensible thing. They passed a law and they said all JFK records have to be made public 25 years after the passage of this law. The bill was signed into law on October 26, 1992 by the first President Bush. So 25 years later is October 26, 2017. So now we're down to the last 3,500 documents that are held by the government.
Take your hat off, please.
There's the story that I've worked on and told, which are the files of George Joanides. Joanides was in charge of psychological warfare operations in Miami in 1963. He was also in charge of an anti-Castro student group called the Cuban Student Directorate. And every month he would go and give them a lot of money, up to $25,000 in cash, which they used to support various anti-Castro activities, anti-Castro propaganda. Well, in the summer of 1963, New Orleans chapter of the Cuban Student Directorate had a series of encounters with Lee Harvey Oswald. The Cuban students saw Oswald handing out Castro pamphlets on the street, and they got into a fight with him. They challenged him to a debate on the radio. They wrote a press release calling for a congressional investigation of Oswald. The Cuban Student Directorate was funded by the CIA and George Joanides at the time of its contacts with Oswald. And in fact, we have Joanides' job performance from the summer of '63, and it says, he's got the Cuban students under control. He's doing a great job. Hours after Kennedy is killed, the Cuban students go to the press and they present the information that Oswald was a leftist. So the president is dead. Oswald is in jail, and the CIA-funded Cuban students are going to the press saying, look, he's a Castro supporter. That story made the front page of the Miami Herald on November 23rd, 1963. It made the Washington Post. They themselves also put out their own publication, which said President of the United States assassinated, and at the top of the page they had a picture of Castro and a picture of Oswald, and it said the presumed assassins. It's dated November 24th, 1963, so it's less than 48 hours after the president's death. So it was the first JFK conspiracy theory ever to reach public print. The first conspiracy theory is published, and it's paid for by George Joanides and the CIA. What's the explanation there? What's my theory? I don't have one. I want the facts. We deserve the facts. The theories have nothing to do with it.
Had JFK not been assassinated, it's doubtful that the Kennedy years, however they might have played out, would have been able to sustain such a dominating presence for half a century. President Kennedy is frozen not just in memory, but at a special moment of peace, prosperity, and surging American power. Style and tragedy are the reasons JFK is still inspiring Americans, old and young. There will probably never be a more attractive couple in the White House than Jack and Jackie. Good looks and fashion sense transcend time. Mrs. Kennedy and the entire Kennedy family were determined that the president's work would continue, so his life and shortened term in office would have more meaning. These efforts mattered because Kennedy's death was the spur to enact many of the promises that otherwise might have remained unfulfilled. The elements have taken a toll on the house that Jack built as a young man, but the legacy that he constructed as president endures. While it has weathered many storms, it still stands as a monument to his service today. The events of John Kennedy's life resonate even in the 21st century. The successes and the failures of his career contain lessons that fully apply to today's challenges. Of the presidents who served from 1950 to 2000, that is, Dwight Eisenhower through Bill Clinton, Kennedy received higher average ratings than any other. and more than half of the respondents named him as one of the top 2 best presidents in the second half of the 20th century.
I teach a course called Media and the Kennedy Era. Many of the students who come into this class have an interest in politics. Some have an interest in journalism. Many members of the Kennedy family and administration were very, very savvy about media and used media to create the legacy of John F. Kennedy as a president. There's a lot of problematic aspects of the Kennedy years, particularly around the manipulation of the media, major problems with his relationship with women. They do seem to come away continuing to hold JFK in high esteem. All the more negative stuff that we look at doesn't really shake that. There's also nostalgia for when there was more of a sense of idealism about political work in Washington. It seems to be impossible to shake the kind of clear-eyed idealism that young people still seem to have for JFK.
Attention. Pay attention to me. Okay, here we go. This is the most critical thing of the whole afternoon, and I want you to know it's a Kennedy half dollar. And this had better still be here when we finish. Okay? Ready? It is tails.
We still care about John F. Kennedy. For somebody who was only president for 1,000 days and had some failures as well as some successes, what is driving this? And my own answer to that is that I think the people like JFK. They like his background. They might even like to be like him. They liked that he went to Harvard. They liked that he published books and won a Pulitzer Prize. They liked that he was a war hero. They liked that he was good looking. They liked that he married well and had a wonderful family. They liked that his family went to Hyannis and they sailed and they played football and they were vigorous and outgoing and youthful. Given all that, you either could have been jealous of him or found reasons to dislike him. And we didn't dislike him. We liked him. And I think that's why we still follow him.
The early 1960s under his presidency, despite it being at the height of the Cold War, was an optimistic, hopeful time in American life. I don't think it's a presidency that's been matched in terms of style and substance.
There's always the thought of what would he have been? What more could he have accomplished?
We often wonder, what will the next century bring? You know, will JFK recede into history as just a one-term president, or will he continue to resonate for generations to come?
Funding for this program